So I'll start off with a little bit about myself. I am a software developer at Tenable Network Security. I contribute a little bit to open source. I have contributed a few patches to Nmap. I have a few commits in the FreeBSD documentation part of the source tree. And I have a GitHub account and stuff. My contact information is there, but I will put that up later. So forewarning, I'm not going to show you how to break SSH because I don't know how to break SSH. I probably trust SSH more than anything else. The problems that it has had have usually been mitigated by other things, and it's generally had a really good track record despite being around for 20 years or so. In the course of researching everything for this talk, I came across some research that's not necessarily related to the topic, so I will include that as well. Hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I did. On the agenda, I plan to show you what SSH is. So for those that are not familiar, hopefully you'll kind of have a better idea of what it does and why you should know how it works. I will explain why it's dangerous in an enterprise environment, and I'll bring you up to speed on previous research and current tools into passively analyzing SSH. So first off, what is SSH? SSH was originally designed to replace those terrible R commands, the kinds that you see in an Nmap scan or an SS scan and go, holy crap, I didn't turn that off. It makes use of strong encryption. And when I say strong, I mean very modern, very up to date. So new technologies like HMAC SHA-256, AES, Blowfish, all the good crypto you could possibly ask for. The transport protocol, which I'll jump into very shortly here, allows you to multiplex many channels, independent channels, over a single SSH session. The most popular implementation today is OpenSSH. I would say it has 98% of clients and servers out there. PuTTY is also very popular if you're on Windows. So if you've used PuTTY, you've probably used OpenSSH, or I'm sorry, you've probably used SSH. The current version of SSH as well is version 2. Version 1 and 1.99 is terribly broken, and you should never use it ever. So, quick introduction to how SSH channels work. So, I don't have it on the slides, and that's totally my bad. On the right side is the client. So the right side is client connecting to the left side. What happens is you get an SSH tunnel, which is in pink. That is your single TCP connection. That manages all of the encryption, all of the authentication, and all of the setup and teardown of these channels that happen inside. So the channels are kind of its own separate protocol that relies on the fact that it is being wrapped by something that already has security built into it. So the pink part is the security of SSH. So in this diagram, when you just do you type SSH and then the host name, you connect to the remote host and you get a shell on it. What happens there is you get your SSH tunnel, which happens after you're authenticated to the host and session keys are exchanged and that kind of thing. And then inside of that, you get your interactive channel, which is for your shell. You can have multiple channels happening inside of that one tunnel. So to illustrate that, let's pretend we're on an untrusted network. So say we're at a coffee shop or we're at SharkFest, and we want to get to google.ca port 80. So what we can do is we can do the same thing we did before, where we did SSH here, but then we also want to forward our local port 5000 to google.ca port 80. So the syntax is a little goofy, but the more you use it, the more you get used to it. So when we first do that, what will happen is we'll get the tunnel created. We get our interactive session because we didn't request that we don't have an interactive session. But you'll notice that there's no channel yet for that port 5000 to port 80. That doesn't happen until a connection is actually made locally. So once we run wget on local port 5000, we will dynamically create a TCP forwarding channel. So our request will go through the forwarding channel and bounce out to google.ca. So that makes you able to do some other really cool stuff like SOCKS proxies, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So perhaps most obvious is that SSH lets you get a remote shell on servers. That's kind of what it was designed to. It was designed to replace things like RSH and RExec. SSH, or at least OpenSSH, integrates with PAM. It integrates with BSD auth. So you can do things like one-time passwords with OP, YubiKey, Barada if you're on Linux, those kind of things. You can use RSA keys and DSA keys. You can also just use plain old passwords. If you're a bit masochistic, you can use Kerberos authentication. You can really choose whatever you like. Another thing is that built into the OpenSSH server is the ability to do SFTP and SCP file copies. So it uses the same kind of authentication, same kind of encryption as regular SSH. And there's also built-in compression. So if you have kind of a low bandwidth link, it can help you out with that. You don't have to worry about gzipping everything before you send it over the wire. Now this is really cool. SSH or at least OpenSSH does, it integrates with X11, where X11, if you're not familiar, is a protocol that a couple of big hunks of software like X.org, X386, those kind of things, implement. So X11 is the protocol that allows you, and the software that implements it, allows you to have windowed applications on your desktop. So out of the box, if you were to install Linux with like a little RAM disk and no real applications, you would be able to get a console, and that's about it. X11 and the software that implements it lets you have Windows, lets you have a desktop, like a display manager and that kind of thing. So the integration with SSH lets you log into a remote host and run a graphical application on the remote host. So the remote host is doing all of the processing, if there's any heavy processing to be done. And then the actual display comes back across the tunnel and displays on your local machine. So it's kind of like RDP, but on steroids. So a place where I use X11 forwarding quite a bit is virtualization. Not this laptop, but my personal laptop is really crappy, doesn't have virtualization extensions, AMDV, VTX, that kind of thing. But I have a really nice desktop that I have sitting under my desk. I don't have a monitor connected to it, and I don't want to have a monitor connected to it. I have enough monitors on my desk already. So I have that one sitting underneath there. It has a network connection, and that's about it. It's really powerful. So what I do is I have my laptop, my crummy laptop. I'm sitting where I'm comfortable. I SSH to that machine under my desk, and I run VirtualBox, like the actual command VirtualBox, on that machine. And I can edit remote network, or I can edit virtual networks. I can edit hosts, that kind of thing. And all of that I can do on my laptop, but all the hard work is being done by that machine. Another kind of, and this is my Wireshark plug, because they, let me talk here at SharkFest, so I may as well talk about Wireshark. If you had a firewall or a gateway or a router that was running Linux, OpenBSD, whatever, something that supports this, you could install Wireshark on that machine. And whenever you wanted to see what kind of traffic was happening on your network, you could SSH to that router, gateway, whatever, run Wireshark, and you would see like the live packet captures and dissections happening on your local machine. But it would be capturing and stuff on that remote machine. As soon as you kill Wireshark, there's no desktop manager. There's nothing like that eating CPU cycles and memory. So kind of a contrived example, but gives you an idea of what you can do with it. Now, I talked about how the channels are dynamically allocated. There's kind of a protocol for asking for new channels built into SSH. So that allows us to have SOCKS proxies. It works the same way as forwarding a static port, except you just say, I want to have a SOCKS proxy on this port. Then you can point Firefox, Internet Explorer, Pigeon, etc. at this port. And then every time you make a new connection, OpenSSH knows how to read the SOCKS header and creates a new channel for that connection, and it goes to the host it needs to go to. Now, that's not enough for you. SSH, OpenSSH anyways, can do layer 3 and layer 2 VPNs out of the box. It requires you to have root access on the remote side, so you create a virtual network interface called a TUN interface on the remote side and the local side, and then you can either forward right down to the Ethernet level or just at the IP level, or IPX or whatever, across the tunnel. So this works, but it has all kinds of weird performance problems because you're forwarding TCP over TCP. So you can imagine if there's problems, if the outside TCP session is retransmitting and the inside is trying as well, but it's waiting for the outside, so you kind of get a snowball effect and you have collapse. So you can do it, not recommended, but you can do it. So if you're at DevCon or if you're at SharkFest and you're worried about your traffic being sniffed or modified, tunnel everything. So this works really well for users and that kind of thing. But if you're in an enterprise environment and you are supposed to be keeping an eye on what your users are doing, it can be really dangerous. We talked about channels already. So we only talked about how the client can forward channels through the server. The client can also request that the server listen on a certain port and forward that back through to itself, which you can imagine is pretty dangerous. So we'll talk about how that can be used to kind of do some dangerous stuff. Oh, and one other thing I didn't mention. So when we talk about port forwarding like that, typically we think it only listens on the loopback interface, and that's correct. That's the default. But you can have those ports listed on external interfaces as well. So we ask the remote server, hey, listen on port 80 externally and forward it to me. If there's no HTTP server there and somebody tries to connect to it by accident, we get it. So here's a kind of a contrived example. We have a corporate workstation and we have an internal server. The internal server has a bunch of services on it that aren't meant to be forwarded or exposed to the internet. Our firewall allows port 22 through, and that's it. The SSH port, I should say. So the corporate laptop is able to SSH through the firewall. And then what it also does is it port forwards whatever ports it needs locally. It has them listen on the external interface so that any untrusted workstations that the employee at home desires to connect to those applications can do so. So kind of scary. Another example, if we have a development network or a testing network, and we also have a production network, say we have ESX or whatever in our development network, and all the developers in your company get their own virtual machines and that kind of thing. Great, but you don't want those machines necessarily touching the production network. With SSH tunnels, you can bounce stuff through the developer's laptop and into the production network. So the thing with this is the developer has to take steps to make this happen. So it's not that bad, but it still kind of shows you that it's Swiss cheesing your firewall a little bit. This is probably the most dangerous. And I have to confess, I did this in college and it works really well. So the college that I attended, we had our external IP addresses, obviously, but then if you were in the college and you were using their internet access, you got an internal address. It was like a 10 dot whatever. Now, inside of that, we had like our Cisco lab where we had all like server rack and we had racks of routers and switches. And that was a NAT within a NAT. So what I did one day is I left my netbook after I'd broken the screen. So it's like, I have to use this for something. So what I did is I had it serving the leftmost server's role. It would SSH to my server at my house, and it would listen on port 5000 externally. And then whatever connections came into that were forwarded to its own port 22. So what I could do from my house is I could connect to my server whenever I liked, and I could forward any ports I wanted through that existing SSH tunnel and get right back into the network. Kind of scary. So basically, developers that are at home can get back in whenever they like, and they can forward anything they like through, and they can touch any other hosts inside the network behind the firewall. So obviously, we have to do something about this. We have to have some kind of solution for handling SSH. Out of the box, it's pretty hard to man in the middle. I think typically what we would do with things like SSL is we buy those appliances that can man in the middle connections, and then we can audit who users are talking to and in what way. Because SSH out of the box doesn't trust things, doesn't have root CAs that it trusts and that kind of thing, it's really hard to man in the middle it. The other thing is that it makes use of Diffie-Hellman, which TLS and SSL typically don't do. You can, but they typically don't. And the way that Diffie-Hellman works is instead of one side choosing a session key, encrypting it with so say I'm the client. Let me start over. Say I'm the client and I desire to talk to the server. So the server sends me its public key. I come up with a session key, which we're going to use for actual communications later. I encrypt it with the server's public key and I send it to the server. The server decrypts it with its private key. Now we have a shared key that we can use that anybody who has been listening on the network does not have. So that works really well. But if down the road, the server's private key is compromised, every previously recorded session can be decrypted as well. And you guys have probably done that in Wireshark before. If you have the secret RSA key, you can decrypt SSL sessions. SSH out of the box uses Diffie-Hellman, which is where both sides kind of just agree on a key. They just come together. No one side really decides. And the thing with the important part of Diffie-Hellman is that the keys are never stored. They're always dynamically generated. So what this basically means is once the sides have authenticated each other, they come up with a key and then they never remember it. So if you've recorded an SSH session or captured it, you can't decrypt it later. So in the real world, I think what we would typically do is we would force SSH traffic through a proxy. So there's two appliances like Balabit's shell control box, which is basically an SSH proxy. You say, I'm going to connect through you and I want you to connect me to this machine. And then that machine, the shell control box, will basically terminate that end of that segment of the SSH traffic, audit everything that's coming through, see what you're forwarding and that kind of thing. And then it'll bounce you to the correct place, encrypting it again. So that's the right way to do it, but the real world is pretty boring. So let's start off with some basic analysis and look at the SSH handshake. So SSH is kind of weird in the sense that when a client makes a connection, the first thing that happens, the very first thing, is that the server says, this is my version, instead of the client offering that information. So if we look at this, the first thing that we can see is that the server says that it supports SSH version 2, which is good. SSH version 2 is great. Anything less than that is not. It also tells us its operating system and the specific version. Now, the client, seeing that, responds in kind with the same kind of information. Once this happens, there's a bunch of other stuff, cryptographic stuff where keys are exchanged and algorithms are negotiated. But this is what we're looking at right now. So this can give us a lot of information about what's on our network. We can see here a few examples that I have selected. We can see that there is an Ubuntu one here, Debian, the specific version of Debian, HPUX, and FreeBSD. Now this HPN, that also can be telling. Some other distributions that don't have the actual version name it or the actual operating system in there will have that HPN. The HPN is actually a third-party patch to OpenSSH that improves network performance. Only a few Linux distributions use that, so that can give us some more information about what we're looking at. The other thing we can do if a user decides, hey, I don't want to give up any of that information, so I'm going to recompile SSH without that information. What we can do is we can look at the negotiated cipher suites to really narrow down the version. So because when SSH, I don't have a diagram for this, but they exchange version strings, and then they both say, these are the ciphers I support. And the other side says the same thing, and whichever is the best, they agree upon. So if you don't see UMAC 64 support, it's probably older than 4.7. CBC mode was preferred before version 5.2 and CTR mode afterwards. So if you're not familiar, CBC and CTR are different block cipher modes. So out of the box, block ciphers just encrypt block by block by block, which means that two identical plaintext blocks will look the same, will have identical ciphertext representations. So if you've ever seen that famous Tux image where it's a bitmap of the Linux icon logo, when you encrypt that under ECB mode, which is when you just do the straight through, there's no chaining or anything, you can still tell that it's a penguin, which is pretty terrifying. CBC and CTR are ways to get around that. CBC is very popular, but in version before 5.2, a vulnerability came out where you could decrypt up to 32 bits of plain text from an SSH session by picking it out of the stream and submitting it to the server after there were no more SSH packets in flight. And what would happen is the server would take those 32 bits and it would treat it like a length because that's the first 32 bits in the SSH protocol. Every SSH packet that comes in, the first 32 bits are treated as a length. So you pick out the 32 bits you're interested in, you submit it to the server decrypts it, treats it as a length, and then waits for the remaining, or waits for that many bytes to show up. So if it decrypts it and treats it as value of length 10, then you send byte by byte, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and once you get up to 10 bytes, the server will say, hey, the message authentication code has failed, the packet is bad, I'm closing the connection. So now you know that those 32 bits that you sent it, which were encrypted, the server treated as a 32-bit integer of value 10. So CTR mode mitigates that. So before 5.2, CBC was used. After, CTR was used. Elliptic curve DSA, which is a way to use smaller keys for authentication with the same level of security, that was added in 5.7. In versions 5.9 to 6.1, there was a draft change to the RFC to specify SSH where they wanted to add truncated SHA-2 support. So that's like SHA-384, SHA-224, I think. Yeah, okay. So that was added in 5.9, and then the request for that change was withdrawn. So it wasn't in the RFC anymore. It wasn't even asked to be in there anymore. So it was removed in 6.1. So that can help narrow it down even more. Authenticated encryption. So that's where you don't encrypt and then apply a message authentication code afterwards, where the encryption itself also serves as authentication. That was added in 6.2. So you might be asking yourself, why do we care about version numbers? And I agree, typically we don't care. So one thing we can tell is what kind of machines are on our network, which I mentioned before. So if you're a Windows shop and you have an Ubuntu machine connecting out somewhere, might give you an idea of what to look for, or might give you an idea to start looking in and seeing what the problems are, or seeing where that machine is on your network. It can also be used to check for vulnerabilities. So this is my Tenable plug. I don't work on this, but we have a product called the Passive Vulnerability Scanner. And in this particular case, there are 90 different checks where it correlates version number information to real-life exploitable vulnerabilities, like the CBC to CTR mode change that I talked about before. So now we're going to get into the more interesting parts, which is looking at user behavior. So the first thing that we have to worry about is pivoting. So if you're in a network, you'll have different parts. Your network will be segmented. You'll have different subnets. And typically those different subnets will have different ingress and egress rules. Your data center doesn't need to talk to the same things that your users do. So a user is having problems getting to, freenode.net or whatever. They want to, chat with people. What they may do is they may bounce their traffic through hosts until they're in a place where they can reach that. And SSH makes that really easy. So penetration testers call this pivoting, so we'll call it pivoting as well. We'll talk about two kinds. The first one is nesting SSH sessions, which I do all the time. And the other kind is using netcat or Ncat to relay traffic. And they have different traffic profiles, which means we need to analyze them in different ways. So when you nest SSH sessions, typically what you'll do is you will SSH to the first machine. So the client is on the right side again, which I'm told is totally non-standard. So anybody who's offended by that, I'm really sorry. The right side SSHs to the second computer in the middle. And what it also does is it forwards support that goes to the SSH server of the far left machine. So then it uses that forwarded channel, which isn't created until you make the connection, but I digress, to step through that and end up connecting to the far left machine. So we can see here that the TCP forwarding channel here is used to wrap the second SSH session. So as you add more hosts, this will obviously, step up and down. So kind of another way to look at it, this is specifically for Tor, but it kind of helps you visualize it in another way. Basically, you have your message on the inside and you just have layers added on. So that has some really interesting, it makes the traffic look really interesting. It makes it really easy to detect. Typically what you do is you look for traffic where an incoming packet is twice the size of an outgoing packet, or the incoming packet is 2/3. I'm not good at math and fractions, but where the outgoing packet is 2/3 the size of the incoming packet. That will tell you how many levels of nesting there are. So because we have with SSH, unless you're using authenticated encryption, you will have a couple of header bytes, which tell you the length. It tells you how long the random padding of the packet is. It will tell you how long the plain text is, or how long the payload is, I should say. And then there'll be a message authentication code, which accounts for a lot if you have short packets. So that means that there's a smallest possible size for an SSH packet. So if we jump to here, this kind of shows you what I'm talking about. The bottom one would be your payload. So say this is a single key press, a single character. You would have all your header fields, and then you would have your payload, and then you'd have your big long message authentication code at the end. So the traffic coming in to a device may look like the top one, and then the one at the bottom would be the traffic exiting, where you have the extra message authentication code and the extra header applied to the top. So this is where I said I would meander a little bit. We're talking about passive analysis, but this is more active. This is a paper by some guys out of North Carolina State U and George Mason University. Basically, there's a lot of big words that I didn't understand, but the one takeaway that I got that I thought was really interesting was watermarking packets by adding small, unique delays between them as they enter the network. And those delays will usually be maintained as those packets traverse the network, even if they are being, even if it's one TCP session terminating and another one being created, and it's just the application layer data passed along. Typically, those delays will be preserved. So I have a kind of a diagram, which a couple people complained about. So I'm sorry, but basically what you don't see here is the network devices in between these computers. So the traffic coming into here would be normal, being forwarded as fast as possible. You get the little bits of jitter from, switches needing to fully buffer a frame and then forward it, that kind of thing. But what happens is the network device will introduce these small delays, and they can be patterns of delays. They can just be one single delay that's unique. And then even though there's two separate TCP sessions, the delays will be preserved throughout. So you can track people pivoting many steps down the network, many steps through the network, I should say. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, cool. This is nice. I can ask questions and stuff and not feel like I'm talking to a huge room. So before I continue, we need to talk a little bit about what side channel attacks are and how they work. A side channel attack is basically when you attack how a crypto system is implemented rather than the actual cryptography itself. So AES is pretty good, but it's pretty easy to use AES wrong, for example. So to explain this through example, we're going to come up with our own secure protocol, which is not a networking protocol. So it's easy to understand. The way our protocol works is, or what we're trying to accomplish, first of all, is we want to be able to write down information securely. We want to write down information on paper without people seeing us. So we tailor our protocol to that. So how we do it is we come into a room, we find a writing surface where we can put our piece of paper down and write. And we look around and we see if there's anybody who's creeping on us and looking at us. If anybody can see the paper, then we find a new writing surface and check again. And we basically continue doing that until nobody has line of sight to our paper. And then we write our information down, fold it up, and put it away. Pretty simple. And at first glance, perfectly secure. Because if nobody can see the paper, nobody can see the message, period. Right? Now, obviously you're thinking, we're going to break this, and you're right, we are. But we're going to break it through side channels. So the first side channel that we look at is that by writing, your body moves, and you can't really prevent that. So even if I can't see the paper, if I can see the eraser moving or your pencil moving or your eyes following the tip of the pencil, can I reconstruct what you said? And you may think no, but what if I had a high precision camera or a high speed camera? This isn't stuff I've actually tried. I'm just kind of guessing that yes, if you put enough work into it, you totally could. Second one is that because we're using a public writing surface, there's going to be friction heat from the pencil on the paper that's going to be transferred into the writing surface. So if I came by with a thermal imaging camera, would I be able to see what you wrote down? Also, the act of writing generates noise. So does the individual, sound profiles of individual letters, is that distinguishable? And if it's not, what if we placed microphones all around you? Would we be able to triangulate the position of the pencil on the paper? So I'm not doing this just to be annoying. I'm doing this because these actually have real world equivalents. The observable movement example is like traffic flow analysis. If somebody's writing a lot, they're probably writing down a lot of information. Kind of seems obvious, but we'll apply that later. The residual heat example is a lot like cold boot attacks, and I'm going to talk about those as well. And the recordable noise from the writing process, that is a lot like acoustic and power analysis, which is insane, but apparently works. And then one that I didn't mention is using compression ratios to attack cryptographic algorithms. So anybody who's not familiar with crime, I'm going to explain this through an example as well. Let's pretend that we have a secretary who is very diligent and very lazy. So this secretary records meetings for various important people throughout the day. He has a notebook, or she, whatever, has a notebook that she uses for everything, for all of the meetings. So she sits in on the first meeting and they discuss some very important stuff about salary changes and that kind of thing and people getting cut from the workforce. And then an hour later, the secretary records another meeting. Now, in the second meeting, the people who are attending the second meeting have a suspicion that bad things were talked about in the meeting before it. So when I said the secretary was lazy, what I meant by that is that the secretary doesn't like writing things more often than they have to. So, sorry, I used they as a singular gender-free noun. I know. I totally think that should be a thing. Anyways, I digress. So the secretary writing down things from this second meeting, if the secretary has heard anything before that he recognizes or remembers, she will use a little form of shorthand and reference that page or that line number in her notebook so that she doesn't have to write more than she has to. So in the second meeting, if I want to confirm that something was said in the previous meeting, I just say what I thought that the people in the previous meeting had said. And I watch how the secretary is writing. And if that secretary is not writing the full sentence out or what I think the full sentence should be, it's very possible that it was said once before. And that leaks information. So that's how the crime attacks work. Basically, the browser will compress traffic before encrypting it. And if you can include the correct text in your request, that's same as, say, the session key, which should be, or sorry, not the session key, the session ID. If those match up or if they're very similar, you can, it will compress better. So that's kind of how the crime attacks work. So first we'll talk about power analysis. This is me meandering a little bit, but I think it's really interesting. So this was introduced in by cryptography research, which is still around today. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Basically, we observe how much power a device is drawing as it's performing a cryptographic operation. So for this to even be feasible, we have to totally reverse engineer the device. We have to know the architecture it's running on. We have to know how the algorithm behaves under different keys, all different kinds of things we have to know. So there's two kinds. There's simple and differential power analysis, and you'll probably see these if you Google it or whatever. Basically, simple power analysis is where you hook up leads to the wire, to the power cable or whatever, and you just watch the rise and flow of current draw. Differential power analysis is when there's noise on the line or whatever, and you have to do some more advanced filtering. That's all that means. So FIPS 140-2, which is the current revision of FIPS 140, doesn't require power analysis resistance at all. So FIPS 140-3, which is due to come out in July, does. So if you have a device that's FIPS 140-2 level 5 certified, there's some recommendations in FIPS 140-2 for power analysis resistance, but there's no requirement for it. So you may have a device I don't want to name any brands because I don't know any that are resistant or not resistant. So I'll just say Chase as an example. You have your Chase Payment Tech pin pad, which has cryptographic keys built into it and stuff. And that device is supposed to be tamper resistant, and you're not supposed to be able to get the cryptographic keys out of it. But if you reverse engineer one of these devices in such a way that you can do power analysis against it, you can recover the keys from every other similar device. So that's pretty scary, and you don't have to tamper with any of them. So you could, now I'm thinking of heists, and that's not going to end well. So yeah, FIPS 140-3 will require it, so something to keep in mind when you're buying devices that need to be resistant to this. So this is an illustration that I shamelessly stole from Wikipedia that shows us recovering 2 bits from a secret RSA key. So this is some device that is performing an RSA signature verification. So it's kind of hard to see, but there's a line going right through the middle. On the left-hand side, this is the step of the algorithm where multiplication is not required, which means there was a 0 bit in the secret key. On the right-hand side, This is the step of the algorithm where multiplication was required, which indicates that there was a 1 bit in the secret key. So this view basically shows us recovering 2 bits from a secret RSA key on a device where we otherwise wouldn't have access to that key. So I said I was going to talk about cold boot attacks. This was pioneered by a couple of people, namely Jacob Applebaum of Tor fame, and also Nadia Henninger. I have no idea how to pronounce her name, but she's very smart. She has a blog post about entropy gathering in embedded devices like routers and how that's difficult and how that can affect the P and Q values in RSA keys, and how it's actually worse to have a bad P or a bad Q than having both of them being bad or having them equally bad across all devices. Very interesting blog post. So typically people consider RAM to be untappable. If everything on my hard drive is encrypted and my laptop is locked and you steal it, typically you think that's okay, because if I can't get past the lock screen, then I have, or if the battery dies at some point, then your data's safe. Now, of course, you can get past lock screen sometimes. There's things like the Inception attack against Mac OS X, which is like very popular, very easy to use. Basically, you use FireWire cables and a crafted FireWire device. And FireWire uses something called DMA, which means that your computer just says, oh, you want to go really fast. So instead of me kind of sanity checking everything you do, I'm just going to give you a bunch of memory. And you can do what you want with that memory. And sometimes it's all the memory in the computer. So in that case, basically the device can just make changes to memory in tactical spots and do things like unlock the lock screen, things like that. So pretending we can't do that, you kind of assume that your data is safe. So in order for, say my screen is locked and but my computer is on, in order for the device to continue to operate, you need to keep the cryptographic keys in RAM. Otherwise you can't read and write from the disk. Kind of makes sense. So typically, if we were to power the device off, we would lose those keys right away. Everything would fade out of memory in kind of an interesting pattern, but it would go away very quickly. The thing is, when you cool memory, it retains its information for a pretty long time. So if you take something like those canned air cans, and you were to, the ones you turn upside down and blast your friends with, and they have to go to the hospital and get a skin graft, those kind of devices, those kind of things, you can point those at memory modules or whatever and cool the RAM enough that it will retain its information for, up to many minutes. So this is kind of what it might look like. I stole this from Google. You basically freeze the RAM, and then without doing a full shutdown, you do like a hard reset. You basically power the computer off in the fastest way possible. And then you boot from something that is designed to preserve as much memory as possible. Something like the GRU Security's RAM number. So in real world, what this would be doing is this would boot. It would probably use BIOS functions. It would switch to protected mode, and it would dump as much memory as possible. It wouldn't do a lot of stuff that other operating system kernels do because you want to damage as little RAM as possible. It dumps everything to a USB drive or similar, and then you can use a tool like Find AES or whatever, which can detect AES keys in memory, and then you could recover the keys for the hard drive. So that's not a problem with AES, that's a problem with the way AES is being used, for example. So now that we know a little bit about how side channels attacks work, we can apply those to SSH. So this is probably the most meaningful analysis of SSH that has been done. Was by Solar designer Doug Song in 2001. The Solar designer is the guy behind Jack the Ripper and OpenWall, if you're familiar. They wrote a tool that is able to detect the password length when you log into the computer and also when you do sudo. So when you sudo root or when you run a command under sudo. And the way that works is when you are typing your password or when you're typing shell commands, typically what will happen is you'll hit the key. Your client will send, it'll send the key that you typed, including the message authentication code and stuff, to the server, and then the server will say, oh, okay, well, we're going to echo that back to screen so that you can see it actually pop up on your terminal. So you hit S and S pops up. So that S will then come back across the wire and it'll show up on your screen. When you type a command, when you do sudo or whatever, you know how it doesn't echo to the screen? You see the same pattern happen on the network. You don't have things coming back to you. And this tool picks up on that. So it can detect how long the password is. It can detect if you're using RSA or DSA authentication. And it can also detect the length of shell commands. So related to that, a tool by Brendan Gregg, who is the guy who does Chaos Reader, which is kind of like DriftNet. What it does is it will capture traffic and dump all information it knows about. So HTML files, images, videos, audio, anything that's like application layer that it recognizes, it will dump. So this tool, what it does is it takes a telnet session from a user and it takes all of their commands that they type, and it kind of comes up with like timing profiles for each of those commands. So the inter-character timing differences. And then it will take an SSH session from the same user and do correlation between the timings and recover as many commands as possible. We'll try to guess what commands were typed during that SSH session. And this still works against SSH version 2. So in the example he provides on his website, in a 20 command SSH session, it only made one mistake, which is 92% accuracy. And that's modern SSH. So we've been talking a lot about how SSH sometimes fails to protect the data that's being transferred, but that's its first thing. That's the first thing that it should do. Something else it should do is it should also keep the user's behavior confidential. So it should keep basically what you're up to, not necessarily only the data that's being transferred. So 2 papers by the same group of people that talk about, the first paper talks about primarily how to detect when people are tunneling and to detect what is being tunneled. So it can tell things like what SMTP traffic looks like with some great degree of accuracy, something like 95%. And then, interactive sessions are also they look very obvious. Tunnel Hunter is the next paper, which is kind of like this, and perhaps more applicable to everybody here. Tunnel Hunter basically talks about how to baseline your traffic, all your traffic, including ICMP, DNS, HTTP, and then using those baselines and comparing it to your traffic today, and using that to detect when something's being tunneled. So if you have, like 200 megabits per second of DNS traffic going in and out, people might be tunneling through DNS. So it kind of talks about how to do that using a lot of big words that I don't understand. So being the peon that I am, I wrote a tool called SSH Flow. It's written in Python. It makes use of the dpacket library, which is pretty sweet. If you're a programmer and you're interested in doing packet analysis, I recommend dpacket. Instead of using all the big words and the concepts like that, I just looked at packet sizes, and it turns out that actually works really well. I can distinguish things like file copies from X11 from interactive sessions. And it can also detect nested tunnels up to 5 layers deep. So it's not pretty. It's not something that, you would point at packet capture and then say, yeah, I'm going to fire that guy because he's using IRC today, like all the time. You would never do that because it can miss, and it's very easy to spoof it. So if you're using compression in your SSH sessions, or if you have multiple channels that are all being used at the same time, it's going to confuse the tool. Just a proof of concept. So I have 2 demos of it, so you guys kind of see in action how easy it is to passively analyze SSH and to automate it. So if you have laptops in front of you and you have an internet connection, I invite you to browse to this. It's not a video. It's not going to totally chew up your bandwidth. It's just like JavaScript and text moving around. So is anybody going to browse to that? Or sorry, that's a bad question to ask a crowd. Who is going to browse to that? I'll leave it up for a second if anybody's going to. Nobody? Okay, cool. I will just demo it up here. It's kind of hard to read. Hopefully you guys will be able to see it. I'll post these links later in case you want to read them or watch them later. So you guys get to judge me for my gross desktop here. Okay. And you also get to judge me for my ability to type. Okay. Yeah, that's really hard to read. I'm sorry. So what I'm doing is I'm starting TCP dump. Not Wireshark, sorry. So the packet capture file is called test.pcap. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a tar archive of the latest SQL mapper source code from my local computer to my FreeBSD web server. And it does. It's only about 4 or 5 megs. So I've stopped TCP dump now, or I'm in the process of it. So the reason that I'm doing TCP dump in another window is because I have to run it with sudo, and this terminal watching application records everything I type. So that'd be pretty stupid if I were to not do that. So I just cleared my screen, and now I'm going to run the SSH flow tool against the PCAP, and it dumps a whole bunch of information. It tells me what plugins it's loaded. So it uses a bit of plugin architecture. It shows me that it has found the SSH handshake correctly. It tells me how many packets it's processed. And then it tells me all the information it knows about. So what the detected cipher suite is, how big the most common packets are, what the most common packet size is, what the average timing is between each one. And then it guesses correctly that it's likely a file copy between the client and the server, from the client to the server. So that works. My recorded demo worked. So I have a second demo. If nobody's going to browse to it, the only difference is that it's a 3 instead of a 2. So very much the same thing. I'm going to start up TCP dump. So if you have like real traffic that you want to run this against, it will handle multiple SSH sessions correctly. I'm just starting TCP dump and ending it right after I get the traffic I want, because if the packet capture is still being recorded, if the file's still open, you can have weird stuff happen. So what I've done is I've logged into my FreeBSD 9 web server. So FreeBSD 9.1 came out a little while ago, but I never patched anything. So this is still FreeBSD 9.0. So I'm editing a file called hello.html. This goes on for a really long time. I'm not very productive, so I'm going to jump ahead if I can figure out how to do that. Yeah, okay. So no HTML document is complete without a doc type. Cool. So like every real hacker does, I'm going to hex dump that HTML file. And hey, it's all ASCII. That's surprising. So flailing enough, I'm going to log out. And then I'm going to stop TCP dump. So clearing my screen again because SSH flow dumps a bunch of information. So dumps the same kind of information as before, tells me how many packets, finds the SSH handshake correctly, and then it guesses once again that it is likely an interactive shell session. So it's pretty easy to automate this kind of basic passive analysis. Basically the summary there. Cool. So kind of wrapping up here, 2 books that if you are interested in this kind of thing and getting more into security, in particular related to this talk, Silence on the Wire is very good. The guy is also on Twitter. His name is Lcamptuf, I think it's his Twitter handle. This is a very good book. It talks about using like how much randomness is in the system's entropy pool to detect how quickly people are typing on the keyboard. Crazy things like that. Very good book. Also, Cryptography Engineering. This is like the de facto book these days for implementing cryptography correctly. So that's not necessarily writing your own versions of AES. That's using AES and HMAC and that kind of thing together correctly. Picking block cipher modes and that sort of thing. If you're also interested in getting more into security and that kind of thing, I highly recommend checking out some Wargames and hacker CTFs. So things like Plaid CTF, which is put on by the Plaid Parliament of Pwning, Ghost in the Shell Code at ShmooCon, DEF CON qualifiers, which I did not participate in this year, poly CTF and that kind of thing. And then there's Wargames, which are online. You can do them at your leisure. There's networks like Over the Wire and Smash the Stack, which host those. In particular, I/O is very good if you're interested in looking at doing things like writing shellcode and doing buffer overflows and stuff like that. So quick recap. We talked about what SSH is and why you should totally learn it. We talked about why it's dangerous, a few less practical and some more practical techniques for following pivots through the network, what side channel attacks are and how they affect pretty much everything. I introduced SSH Flow, and then I showed you a little bit of recommended reading and some CTF challenges. This website here, ctftime.org, is pretty sweet. It shows you all upcoming, well, not all, but quite a few of the upcoming CTF challenges. You can register a team there, and you can kind of keep track of how you're doing, how your team's doing, and how other teams are doing. And then we did a recap, So that is my talk. Thank you very much for attending. I think I'm a little early on time. Does anybody have any questions or? What the deal was all that? Oh, okay. So the question was, what was the deal with challenge 7? Did anybody do the packet challenges here? Yeah? Okay. I'm really sorry about that.